everybody, I'm Luna. Welcome back to Luna Ơi. This is part 2 in my series showing real stories from Vietnamese war veterans for the first time in English. In part 1, we focus on Vietnam's resistance war against the imperialist USA, started from 1950s to 1975. Today, we will hear stories from 1979 until 1989, during which time Vietnam had a border war with China and also fought to put an end to the genocidal Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia. This chapter of Vietnamese history is almost unknown in the West. The border wars are hardly mentioned at all in the English-speaking sphere, and whenever they are mentioned, the information is usually from a Western perspective and almost always distorted and inaccurate. So now I will do my best to give you the story in detail about this very complicated period of time from our own perspective, including stories straight from the mouth of some of the people who were actually involved in the conflicts. Let's start by introducing Pol Pot, who took over the Communist Party of Cambodia and turned it into the Khmer Rouge regime. Side note, Cambodia is the Khmer name for Cambodia, so from now on, I will call Cambodia Cambodia. Pol Pot's real name was Saloth Sar, and he was born in 1925 to a rich farming family in Cambodia. Pol Pot was a Khmer nationalist who believed in the superiority of Khmer people over other people. In particular, he believed that Vietnamese peoples were ethnically inferior to Khmer peoples. It's very important to note that Pol Pot's nationalism is right-wing nationalism, totally and completely opposite to the left-wing nationalism of countries like Vietnam, Laos, and Cuba. If you find this confusing, I have a video explaining the difference between right-wing chauvinist nationalism and left-wing internationalist nationalism in the description. Anyway, Pol Pot traveled to Paris in the 1940s, where he joined the Communist Party of France. He came back to Cambodia in 1953 and joined the Khmer Vietnamese, a branch of the League for the Independence of Vietnam in Cambodia, which was led by Ho Chi Minh. Pol Pot then joined the Khmer People's Revolutionary Party in the late 50s and slowly gained more and more power. In 1962, Pol Pot assassinated Tho Samao, the chairman of the Khmer People's Revolutionary Party. Tho Samao was considered the first victim of Pol Pot on his path to power. This assassination allowed Pol Pot to consolidate his power, and he immediately took over the Khmer People's Revolutionary Party. Before Pol Pot's takeover, Cambodian and Vietnamese communists had a strong, close relationship, and there were high hopes for Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos uniting into a power bloc, which would make them the strongest political base in Southeast Asia, which would enable our countries to eliminate colonialism once and for all. Remember that Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos were all colonized by France, and France referred to our nations together as French Indochina. Our original Communist Party was even called the Communist Party of Indochina, so we had a very long history of working together going back decades. But once Pol Pot took power, he immediately kicked out every high-ranking member who supported Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh. So right from day one of taking power, Pol Pot immediately turned his back on Vietnam and made us his enemy. In the late 60s, Pol Pot transformed his party into the Communist Party of Cambodia, aka the CPK. At that time, the CPK was very unpopular amongst the Cambodian people, and the CPK mostly hid in the jungle trying to recruit more members. During this time, Pol Pot seek help from China, Vietnam, and Laos. At the same time in Cambodia, Lon Nol, a general backed by the USA, was trying to coup Sihanouk, the king of Cambodia. The king wanted to take revenge against Lon Nol, and he saw Pol Pot as a useful ally. So he came to support Pol Pot, hoping that he would take down Lon Nol. Sihanouk was well known in Cambodia for his policy of staying neutral during the Vietnam War, while Lon Nol was openly an ally of the USA. The Cambodian people wanted to support Vietnam in the war and did not want to back the USA, so Lon Nol became very unpopular with the Cambodian people. Pol Pot took advantage of this and tried to build his popularity in the people of Cambodia by pretending to support Vietnam against the USA. Pol Pot even traveled to Vietnam in 1966 to meet with Ho Chi Minh, as well as Khe Son Phomvihanh, the chairman of the Communist Party of Laos. And there was some hope that Pol Pot would return to the alliance with Laos and Vietnam. This was a great propaganda for Pol Pot, as Cambodian communists were excited at the prospect of restoring an alliance. And Pol Pot used his new wave of popularity to build power against Lon Nol. Unfortunately, Pol Pot quickly turned his back once more on Vietnam. From 1970 to 1973, while Vietnam was still fighting against USA occupation, Pol Pot and his army attacked Vietnamese Communist army stations 174 times. Pol Pot's minions stole weapons and food and killed more than 600 Vietnamese soldiers during these raids. In 1973, when Vietnam signed the Paris Peace Accords with the USA, Pol Pot announced that it was a betrayal of Vietnam to the revolution of Indochina. And he organized protests to kick Vietnamese soldiers out of Cambodia, despite the fact that Cambodian communists had agreed to support Vietnam in our fight against imperialist USA back in the 50s and 60s. By 1975, Pol Pot had amassed enough of a following to overthrow Lon Nol in Phnom Penh. Pol Pot allowed King Sihanouk to become the head of the state of Cambodia after removing Lon Nol, but in name only, the king didn't really have any actual power. 1 year later, in 1976, the king resigned after seeing the direction which Pol Pot was taking Cambodia. After 1975, as Prime Minister, Pol Pot became the most powerful man in what came to be called Democratic Cambodia. This was also the time he officially changed his name from Salazar to Pol Pot. He also changed the name of the Communist Party of Cambodia to the Party of Democratic Cambodia, or the PDK, also infamously known as the Khmer Rouge. At this point, the Khmer Rouge under Pol Pot's leadership started to purge and kill even more party members from East Cambodia who supported Vietnam. At first, Pol Pot and his party claimed to be Marxist-Leninists to gain support from Cambodian people, but right after he took power, he immediately betrayed all the values that he had claimed to uphold. Marxism-Leninism just became a cover which he cynically abused and abandoned as he perpetrated his crimes against humanity. Pol Pot's vision of socialism was not rooted in material conditions or class struggles to free the proletariat. It was more of a racially supremacist form of fascism, which sought to destroy all industry and eradicate all cities and force everyone to live in a primitive peasant lifestyle. One of the main principles of dialectical materialism, the underlying philosophy of Marxism-Leninism, is grounding our beliefs and actions in science and materialism. But Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge rejected science altogether, replacing it with superstition and pseudo-scientific notions of Khmer supremacism over all other ethnicities. From 1975 to 1978, the Khmer Rouge continuously attacked the border of Vietnam from Ha Tien to Tây Ninh. He also launched attacks against Phu Quoc Island and Thổ Chu Island. Pol Pot's forces killed thousands of Vietnamese villagers, including women and children, while stealing hundreds of tons of rice, destroying our rice fields, and committing various other atrocities. Remember that this was right after our brutal war with the USA. We didn't have any time to recover, and now we were already facing a new threat right on our border. It was during this time that Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge revealed their true scheme. They wanted to restore the mighty empire of Angkor. The Angkor Empire used to be the most powerful empire in Southeast Asia from the 9th to 15th centuries. You may be wondering about what happened to the Angkor Empire. Most historians believe that around the year 1400, the Angkor Empire suffered two severe droughts. One lasted for 30 years and the next lasted for 20 years. This natural disaster terribly weakened the Angkor Empire and led to its total collapse in 1431. This history is important to understand if you want to know why Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge hated Vietnam so much. As an excuse for another attack against Vietnam in June 1977, Khmer Rouge leaders officially announced that Vietnam was the #1 internal enemy of Cambodia. They blamed Vietnam for the collapse of the original Khmer Empire and invented a fake history in which we were mortal enemies, despite the fact that Vietnam never did any harm to Cambodia and that we had been strong allies and supported each other for decades against French colonialism and Western imperialism. But Pol Pot needed an excuse to attack Vietnam, which was very popular in Cambodia, as I explained before. So Pol Pot had to propagandize all sorts of anti-Vietnam lies. Pol Pot claimed that Vietnam wanted to end the existence of the Khmer people and create a new federation of Vietnam in Indochina.
If the border problem is a very small problem, that is not important. The real problem is that Vietnam wants to take possession of the whole of Cambodia, to put Cambodia under his thumb.
This claim was completely baseless, but Pol Pot spread it viciously to stoke fear and hatred of Vietnamese people in Cambodia. The new government of Vietnam desperately tried to settle the situation and calm things down through diplomacy, because we were still reeling from decades of war against Japan, France, and the USA. The last thing we wanted was more war and conflict with Cambodia. Vietnam was still freshly devastated. We had just been bombed back to the Stone Age, and we were very tired of war. But the straw that broke the camel's back was the Ba Chuk massacre in 1978. On April 18th, the Khmer Rouge came to a village called Ba Chuk in An Giang province. They forced innocent villagers out of their houses and slaughtered them. In just one day, they murdered 3,157 villagers, most of whom were elders, women, and children. There were over 100 families that were completely wiped out in Ba Chuk. By July 1978, the Khmer Rouge had killed over 5,000 Vietnamese, injured another 5,000 more, and kidnapped more than 20,000 Vietnamese people to make them slaves in their labor camps. Thousands of schools, hospitals, medical centers, churches, and pagodas near the Cambodian border were destroyed. About 500,000 Vietnamese living near the border with Cambodia had to flee their homes further east to escape the raids of the Khmer Rouge. So now you know a little more about the crimes which the Khmer Rouge committed against Vietnam. But what about the Cambodian people who live under this genocidal regime? Under the leadership of Pol Pot, Cambodia went back to the Dark Ages. The Khmer Rouge wanted to build a primitive agriculture utopia where there would be no cities, no hospitals, no schools, no religion, no money, and no books. In the name of this mission, they forced millions of Cambodian people to leave cities to work on labor farms, which were essentially concentration camps. They forced intellectuals to marry uneducated people. They forced beautiful people to marry ugly people, and imposed many other eugenics and forced breeding programs on their own people with the belief that this would create a supreme generation of Khmer people. Today, you can go to the Museum of Khmer Rouge Crimes and see shocking evidence of these atrocities. It's one of the most disturbing places that I've ever been in my life. In just 4 years, from 1975 to 1979, Khmer Rouge killed over 2 million of their own Cambodian people, which was 25% of the whole Cambodia's population. In addition to this horrifying genocide, hundreds of thousands more Cambodians had to flee to Vietnam to escape. The Khmer Rouge was one of the most deadly and horrifying regimes in human history, and it's hard to explain just how evil they were. Many of the crimes committed by the Khmer Rouge I can't even tell you about on YouTube because this video would get restricted. But if you do some basic research, it's not hard to find the disgusting photographs and other evidence of these crimes. The crimes against humanity of the Khmer Rouge were so unspeakable that eventually the Cambodians finally rose up against them. On July 20, 1977, a 25-year-old soldier of the Khmer Rouge, Hun Sen, along with 4 soldiers, decided to desert from the Khmer Rouge and ran to Vietnam to look for help. 2 years later, in 1979, as an official answer to the call for help from the Cambodian people, as well as an answer to the mass murder of Vietnamese and Cambodian people, Vietnam officially sent an army to Cambodia to end the genocidal regime of the Khmer Rouge. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese soldiers volunteered to go fight for the freedom of the Cambodian people. It only took Vietnam a few months to kick Pol Pot out of the Cambodian government, but it took another 10 years for the Vietnam and Cambodia Liberation Army to completely defeat the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot and set up a new government for Cambodia with Hun Sen as a new prime minister. According to the book Second Life, Second Death, The Khmer Rouge After 1978 by Kelvin Rowley, the Khmer Rouge officially renounced communism in 1981. There's a link to a PDF of the book in the description if you want to learn more. The important thing to understand is that Pol Pot was not a communist nor a Marxist-Leninist. He was a ruthless opportunist who took advantage of the popularity of communism and Marxist philosophy to build power for himself and commit horrible crimes which had nothing to do with the liberation of the working class whatsoever, just like so many fascists who came before and after him. And it was this communist Vietnam which liberated Cambodia and unseated the murderous Khmer Rouge regime. Now, with all this in mind, let's listen to the stories of Vietnamese volunteer soldiers who fought against the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia.
From 1969 to 1975, me and my unit had been fighting hundreds of battles together. I don't know how many of my comrades died. Many of their graves were lost. Many long nights I couldn't sleep. Their sacrifice was so great. War is the most heartrending, the most fierce loss and pain. After successfully defending our southwest borders, Vietnam's volunteer army, alongside the Revolutionary Armed Forces and people of Cambodia, defeated the reactionary army of Pol Pot and freed Phnom Penh. On January 7, 1979, we ended the genocidal regime Khmer Rouge. Bullets and bombs, much blood and bones of Vietnamese soldiers were shed on the land of our neighbor country to protect peace for the Cambodian people. There were many fierce fights. My unit fought together and died together. The love between the soldiers was very strong. When one died, the loss was great. As a soldier who personally joined the war, Colonel Win Chi could never forget the pain of losing his comrades in battle. For over 20 years, he and many comrades from K93 Martyr Remains Gathering Team of An Giang Province went through days of great hardship searching in the middle of the jungle. They found and brought back the remains of more than 3,300 Vietnamese martyrs in Cambodia. The sun, the rain, the storms, the worst time that we had gone through was stormy season. For a whole month long, my shirt was never dry. There was a day when we kept digging until it got dark and we found 7 comrades. Uncle Chi taught us that the remains of the Vietnamese martyrs were usually wrapped in a piece of rubber. When we were digging, whenever we heard the sound of the rubber cloth, suddenly all our weariness had gone. With great effort in looking for the martyrs' remains in the summer this year, 41 martyrs were found and reunified with their comrades. This, to some extent, helped ease the pain of their comrades and family members. We need to be determined, more determined, to find and bring back the last of our martyrs.
Để tìm được cái người đó là cuối cùng nó đem về tổ quốc.
After watching this, you might ask, how could Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge fight back for nearly a decade when they were so weak compared to Vietnam's volunteer army? Unfortunately, Pol Pot had some powerful friends. The Khmer Rouge was backed by China, the USA, the UK, Thailand, Singapore, and indeed the whole United Nations. This might sound shocking, but it's true. I will show evidence here and also put links in the description where you can learn more and see for yourself. But you might be asking, why on earth did China, an ally of Vietnam in the Vietnam War, become the main supporter of the Khmer Rouge? And how did all of this affect Vietnam, the only country on earth that dared to stand up to Pol Pot to end the existence of his genocidal regime? Well, I will now try to answer that question from a Vietnamese perspective. But first, let me say this. I know for a fact that Westerners often try to use this history to drive a wedge between Chinese and Vietnamese communists. I also know that Westerners will try to clip out this video and take it out of context for me attacking China. This is something Westerners always do, which is why I usually tend to avoid talking about things like this on my channel. Because people in imperialist countries love to try to sow division and hatred between Asian communists. So let me just say, I am going to tell you the facts as I understand them. This is all history, and I hold no grudge against China over the history I'm about to tell you today. This all happened decades ago, and today, China and Vietnam are close partners, and China has done a lot to help Vietnam in recent history. So all that being said, let's begin. In order to answer this question, we have to look back further to the 1950s and 60s in Vietnam and the geopolitical relationship between China and the USSR at this time. When the USA occupied the south of Vietnam and established its puppet regime there, China was naturally worried for their own safety. The north of Vietnam, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, had followed communism and thus became a perfect candidate for security buffer zone for China, sort of how North Korea serves as a buffer between China and the USA-occupied South Korea. That was the main reason China supported North Vietnam. Another thing to understand is that both China and the Soviet Union wanted Vietnamese communists to slow down our fight for reunification in the 50s and 60s. Both Soviet and Chinese communists doubted that North Vietnam was strong enough to defeat the USA, and they were afraid that trying to liberate the south of Vietnam would fail and jeopardize communism throughout all of Vietnam. So they applied a lot of pressure to try to get us to stop fighting and abandon the south. Vietnam refused these demands, and Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party of Vietnam stood their ground with the goal of reuniting North and South Vietnam as soon as possible. This required extremely careful and shrewd diplomacy on behalf of Vietnamese communists, who had to persuade both China and the USSR to continue to aid Vietnam while preserving our integrity and maintaining our original goal of uniting North and South Vietnam. Of course, it's only natural that the USA and other imperialist nations saw this as an opportunity to sow division and mistrust between China, the Soviet, and Vietnam, especially since China and the USSR were having conflict of their own during this time. In the 1960s in particular, the relationship between China and the USSR became worse and worse. This conflict hit with the border skirmish between the two nations in 1969. Vietnam was in a very uncomfortable situation because both China and the USSR were important allies and supporters in our war effort against the USA. In the end, Vietnam was forced to pick a side, and Vietnam decided to side with the USSR. This stoked tensions between Vietnam and China. Eventually, of course, Vietnam won our war against the USA and its puppet regime in the south of Vietnam, and we were able to reunite our country despite the doubts of the USSR and China. But this victory came with its own difficulties. China feared that Vietnam, allied with Cambodia and Laos, would become the next superpower in Asia, and that this would threaten the position of China, especially when Vietnam was backed by the enemies, the Soviets. So the rise of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge and their intense hatred of Vietnam became the perfect poker card for China to use to keep Soviet-backed Southeast Asian communists from growing too powerful right on their border. The USA at this time was also still sour about their loss in the so-called Vietnam War, but they were also smart enough to not openly support the Khmer Rouge due to the crimes against humanity that they perpetrated against their own people. So they secretly encouraged China to buy the Khmer Rouge behind the scenes. Mao Zedong died in 1976 and Deng Xiaoping took power in 1978. Unfortunately, Deng Xiaoping was very hostile against Vietnam, and he decided to stop aiding Vietnam and redirected all that aid to the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. Up until the 1980s, 90% of weapons, money and food sent to the Khmer Rouge came from China, while the other 10% came from the UK, Thailand and Singapore, with all of this aid orchestrated by the USA, of course. The USA under President Jimmy Carter also wanted to see the USSR and its allies weakened, and they saw China and Cambodia as useful temporary allies. Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter both met early in their respective administrations, and during their first meeting, Deng told Carter,
China must still teach Vietnam a lesson.
Deng then went to Japan to meet Prime Minister Masayoshi Ohira and said the same thing. So, China under Deng was determined to undermine Vietnam, while building up the Khmer Rouge in an effort to check the USSR's influence in Southeast Asia. These official visits were all taking place as Vietnam was just beginning the military campaign into Cambodia to fight against the Khmer Rouge. And just 2 weeks after the official visit between Deng Xiaoping and Jimmy Carter, on February 17, 1979, China sent an army of 300,000 soldiers and 400 tanks to attack the 1,400-kilometer-long border between China and Vietnam. This first attack lasted for 1 month with great losses on the Vietnam side. On the night of March 9, 1979, the Chinese army went to a Vietnamese village near the border with China, Dong Trup Village. They captured and slaughtered 43 villagers with bayonets and bamboo sticks. All of the victims were women and children. The real intention behind these attacks was weakening and distracting Vietnam by forcing us to fight on two fronts at the same time. China under Deng was the biggest supporter of the Khmer Rouge, and it was believed that forcing Vietnam to withdraw a part of our army from the fight against the Khmer Rouge to defend against the Chinese invasion would be too much for Vietnam to handle. And it's true, Vietnam did have to move some forces from Cambodia to deal with the invasion from China. To justify the invasion of Vietnam, China claimed that Vietnam had provoked and bullied China first, and that their invasion was intended to teach Vietnam a lesson. But in fact, there was no justification for the invasion of Vietnam, and Vietnam was hardly in a position. Just after being devastated by decades of war with the USA, and while fighting a war with Cambodia to bully a superpower neighbor to the north. Another excuse for the attack on Vietnam by China was that Vietnam wanted to do ethnic cleansing of Chinese Hoa people in Vietnam in 1977, and therefore China invaded Vietnam to protect their own people. This is also a very insidious lie. The truth is, after 1975, Vietnam wanted to rebuild our country, and we wanted all Chinese people to take Vietnamese nationality and become an official ethnic minority of Vietnam. This would be the first time Chinese people were given citizenship in Vietnam, and with this new nationality, the ethnic Chinese would be given equal rights with all other Vietnamese, such as voting rights, the right to join the Communist Party, the right to become government workers, and so on. But many Chinese in Vietnam didn't want to take our nationality because they were afraid that they could be called to serve our military and they could be sent to Cambodia, which I can totally understand, to be honest. To justify attacking Vietnam, Deng Xiaoping's agents began spreading another lie that Vietnam would kill all the ethnic Chinese in Vietnam, which was obviously frightened to ethnic Chinese. This prompted about 160,000 ethnic Chinese in the north of Vietnam to flee back to China around 1978. There's a lot more to this story, but what's important to understand is that there was never any proof whatsoever that Vietnam was planning any sort of genocide against Chinese people, and in fact, no such genocide ever took place. These were all lies used by China to justify an unjust and unprompted invasion of Vietnam to weaken and distract our efforts against the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. It's also very important to point out that Vietnam never forced anyone to go fight a war against Cambodia. All the soldiers who fought against Pol Pot were volunteers. It's also important to recognize that tens of thousands of ethnic Chinese Vietnamese bravely volunteered to join the Vietnamese army after 1975. To this day, there are around 750,000 Chinese Vietnamese living here in Vietnam, and they are an important part of our national community who have made many contributions to our economy, culture, and building our path to socialism. The short but very brutal border war between Vietnam and China caused more than 26,000 deaths of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians. This began a very dark chapter of the relationship between Vietnam and China. In the 10 years from 1979 to 1989, there were a few more conflicts between the two countries. In 1989, when the remnants of the defeated army of Khmer Rouge were finally eliminated, the new Prime Minister Hun Sen's government became powerful enough to run the country, and Vietnam withdrew entirely from Cambodia. This was also when China stopped attacking its own border with Vietnam. Vietnam and China finally normalized our relationship in 1991 when Chiang Chai-min became the chairman of the People's Republic of China. I want to make it clear that Vietnamese people today hold no ill will towards Cambodia or China. This was a very unfortunate chapter of our history, and we really just want to close the door on it. While we never forget, we are very quick to forgive and move forward. Today, Vietnam trades more with China than with any other country, and China has made many important contributions to Vietnam, such as building our metro system in Hanoi, which I have made a video about. Link is in the description. But I think it's important to say that even though I think China's actions against Vietnam during this period were completely unjustified, I don't hold any grudges, and neither do most Vietnamese. We just hope that this can serve as a lesson for how terribly relations between communist nations can become, so we can avoid these kinds of conflicts in the future. So now let's listen to the memories of Vietnamese soldiers who fought in this Vietnam-Sino border war.
There were 10 more martyrs found for a total number of 108 martyrs that were found by the gathering team of Ha Giang province over many years. In 10 years of the fight to defend our northern borders of our motherland, more than 4,000 Vietnamese soldiers died here. There are still 2,000 martyrs that have not been found in these Rocky Mountains on the border between Vietnam and China. Dear friends, 38 years ago, early in the morning, in the campaign MB-84, our unit was assigned to take back latitude 712. Many of our comrades died right here on that day. I still remember the night 38 years ago. Everything was deadly quiet and pitch black. Regiment 876 had fought the battle on July 12th. 602 soldiers died that day. At that time, I was the youngest soldier of Battalion 3. I had just finished the 10th grade. I had only been in the military for 4 months. In my battalion, I was the first one to shoot. At first, I was so scared, but then I saw my comrades getting injured and died, and all of that fear went away. With great effort in looking for the martyrs' remains in the summer of this year, our Regiment 2 also lost more than 200 soldiers here. After their Regiment 568 went up here and took our place, and at that time we lost 300 more soldiers, so in total, we lost more than 500 soldiers on the east side of the Low River. The two sides of the Low River are all one. They all belong to our beloved motherland, and we had to protect it. We are so proud that we successfully defended every single inch of our motherland. Brothers, we are standing on our motherland today. This is a victory. Yes, it is. After campaign MB-84, the fight to gain back our peaks in Vie Xuyen battlefield became more and more fierce. On January 19, 1985, in a fight to defend Peak 685, a soldier, before he died, left a vow carved on his gun. Martyr Nguyen Viet Ninh wrote, "Live by the rock to fight the enemy, die turning into immortal rocks." His words spread far and wide among our soldiers in the Vie Xuyen battlefield. Many soldiers leaned into the cliffs to fight and then died on those cliffs. The last words of Martyr Nguyen Viet Ninh became a message to all soldiers who fought for the motherland in Vie Xuyen.
Sông Bam Đa đánh giặc, chết hóa đá bất tử thành lũy đôi mươi, bờ cõi non sông đời đời. Chốt biên cương, đội hình Bam Đa tung hoành, thâu đêm vết thương, khoảnh khắc tạm ngưng trận đánh. Vách chiến hào ghi chặt cây sung tâm tình, thao thức bên nhau khắc ghi tâm nguyện ngày xanh. Sông Bám Đá đánh giặc, chết hóa đá bất tử, lời thề tuổi xuân nước Nam hào khí vọng vang. Sông Bám Đá đánh giặc, chết hóa đá bất tử, thành lũy đôi mươi, bờ cõi non sông đời đời. Sông Bám Đá đánh giặc, chết hóa đá bất tử, thành lũy đôi mươi, bờ cõi non sông đời đời.
My name is Vo Chan Chien. I'm a member of the Veteran Association in My Khanh Village, Hoa My, Hoa Nyon, Binh Dinh. When the Southwest Border War happened, the division assigned me to Regiment 95. The battlefield in Cambodia was very fierce. I got injured in 1981, and now I live on welfare for veterans with 81% injury. Whenever there was a minute of silence, I immediately felt the value of peace. Many times a comrade was just sitting there, but a moment later he was gone. War means loss, sacrifice, and lots of blood.
Every old veteran who walked out of the war kept in their heart the memories of those fierce days. They don't just live for themselves, but also for the dreams of their comrades who died in the war.
I was lucky to be alive. I feel deeply sorry for all my comrades who sacrificed in the war. When we fight, we must fight to our last drop of blood, but I made a promise. If I got out alive, I would do whatever I can to help my people. To deserve the sacrifices of my comrades, to deserve to be called Uncle Ho's soldier.
Before ending my video, I want to talk a little about how other countries like the USA, the UK, Thailand, and Singapore, and even the whole United Nations have Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. First, let's talk about the USA. In 1981, the U.S. National Security Consultant Zbigniew Brzezinski said,
I encouraged the Chinese to support Pol Pot. Pol Pot was an abomination. We could never support him, but China could.
It was revealed in a letter to a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the U.S. Congress that from 1980 to 1986, the U.S. secretly sent $85 million to Pol Pot. During the 80s, along the borders between Thailand and Cambodia, the CIA, along with some other U.S. organizations, set up a so-called refugee camps in a program called CARE to give aid to the Khmer Rouge soldiers. Two U.S. relief aid workers, Linda Mason and Rosa Brown, who worked at these camps, wrote,
The U.S. government insisted that the Khmer Rouge be fed. The U.S. preferred that the Khmer Rouge operation benefit from the credibility of an internationally known relief operation. In 1980, under U.S. pressure, the World Food Program handed over food worth $12 million to pass on to the Khmer Rouge. And that year I traveled on a UN convoy of 40 trucks into Cambodia from Thailand and filmed a UN official handing the supplies over to a Khmer Rouge general, Nam Phan, known to Western aid officials as the Butcher. There is little doubt that without the support and the flow of arms from China through Thailand, the Khmer Rouge would have withered on the vine.
The CIA in May of 1980 denied that there had been any executions in the last 2 years of the Pol Pot regime. In fact, 500,000 innocent people were killed during that period. Even well after the killing fields were unearthed, the U.S. continued to legitimize the Khmer Rouge, voting at the UN Geneva Conference in 1981 to defeat an ASEAN proposal that the Khmer Rouge be disarmed.
So it is clear that the USA and China under Deng Xiaoping, despite the differences in ideology, shook hands with each other in secret to weaken Vietnam and the USSR, even if it meant supporting a brutal genocidal dictator like Pol Pot to do so. The UK under Margaret Thatcher also played a hand in supporting Pol Pot. This remained a secret all the way up to 2000 when John Pilger, an Australian journalist, uncovered earlier work of Simon O'Dwyer Russell, another journalist who had a close connection with the Special Air Service, a special forces unit of the British Army. This reporting revealed the truth, as one SAS source was documented as saying,
We first went to Thailand in 1984. Since then, we have worked in teams of 4 and 8 and have been attached to the Thai army. The Yanks and us work together. We're close like brothers. We train the Khmer Rouge in a lot of technical stuff, a lot about mines. We trained them in the Mark V rocket launchers and all sorts of weapons. We even gave them psychological training. At first, they wanted to go into the villages and just chop people up. We told them how to go easy. Some of us went up to 100 miles inside Cambodia with them on missions. There were about 250 of us on the border at any one time, and a lot of those would change sides given half the chance. That's how pissed off we are. We hate being mixed up with Pol Pot. I tell you, we are soldiers, not child murderers. It costs £500,000 to train one of us. Putting us in the service of a lunatic like Pol Pot makes no sense. There is no insurgency in Cambodia that threatens us.
O'Dwyer Russell died of a heart attack in 1990, a few years after these interviews, when he was just 29 years old. Margaret Thatcher and the British government have denied all of the evidence that has come out against them. But the records speak for themselves, and it's clear that Thatcher's administration supported the brutal atrocities of the Khmer Rouge even against the advice of their own SAS officers. Thailand and Singapore also served as henchmen of the US and the UK by helping to deliver weapons and money to the Khmer Rouge, knowing fully that they were helping a genocidal regime, and Thailand even gave sanctuary to Pol Pot and other high-ranking members of the Khmer Rouge after they fled Cambodia. Throughout all the meetings at the United Nations during the 1980s and 90s, there were only 2 countries that openly supported Vietnam and criticized the crimes against humanity of the Khmer Rouge and Pol Pot. These nations were the USSR and Czechoslovakia. The US, the UK, and their lapdogs kept voting to maintain the seat of the Democratic Kampuchea, aka the Khmer Rouge, in the United Nations. And the whole world took this as an excuse to comprehensively sanction Vietnam from 1978 until 2006, when Vietnam finally officially normalized relations with the USA. Finally, in 1997, with the agreement between Cambodia's new government and the United Nations, extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, the ECCC, was formed. This is a special court which oversees justice against the Khmer Rouge and their crimes against humanity. 25 years later, on September 23, 2022, the last living leader of the Khmer Rouge, Khieu Samphan, received a life sentence from the ECCC. The genocide committed by the Khmer Rouge on its own people has now become well known all over the world. Nobody can deny Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge crimes against humanity. Not a single country that once sanctioned Vietnam for saving the Cambodian people has ever apologized for what they did. Instead, reactionaries have tried to revise history, blaming Pol Pot's crimes on communism, or to paint communism as an evil ideology. They conveniently forget that it was communist Vietnam that stopped the Khmer Rouge genocidal regime. And it was capitalism and imperialism that fed this regime and made it 100 times harder for Vietnamese and Cambodian people to save themselves. I will end this video with a speech from Hun Sen, who remains Prime Minister of the Kingdom of Cambodia from 2014.
Only Vietnam, under the leadership of the Communist Party of Vietnam, voluntarily sent her children and loved ones to help liberate and save the lives of the Cambodian people in times of great danger, when Cambodia begged the whole world to come and rescue us. The Vietnamese volunteers' help, given by their own blood and bones, was the most humane and righteous aid. This support should have been the main obligation of the international community in helping a people in need because of the Pol Pot regime's policy of institutionalized, top-down, organized genocide.